This is HOA neighbor court. They wanted control. Karen yelled that the board had to vote again, and until they did, I was in violation every day. You are not allowed to ignore notices, she shouted, waving a clipboard at me while I stood in my own backyard with a post hole digger in my hands and mud on my boots. I had not ignored anything. I had submitted my fence application 6 weeks earlier, received written approval 3 days ago, and hired a contractor who was scheduled to arrive in less than an hour. But Melissa Lewis, Welcome Committee Chair for the Harbor Point Fence Compliance Association here in Montreal, Quebec, did not care about any of that. She cared about the fact that I had dared to start digging without giving her personal notice, and now she was threatening to fine me $200 per day until I stopped. I am an accountant who keeps a clean ledger and receipts, so I already had copies of every email, every approval stamp, and every payment confirmation in a folder on my kitchen counter. But none of that mattered to Melissa, because she had decided this fence was illegal the moment she saw the contractor truck pull up to my curb. The intermittent drizzle had started 20 minutes earlier, right around the time I finished marking the property line with string and stakes. I had used the survey map the title company gave me when I bought the house last year, measured twice, and confirmed the setback matched the HOA covenant to the inch. Melissa showed up 10 minutes after that, walking across my lawn without asking, already holding a roll of caution tape like she was about to cordon off a crime scene. She did not introduce herself. She did not ask what I was building. She just pointed at the stakes and said, "This is not a fence, it is an encroachment." That was the first time she said it, and I could already tell it was going to be her favorite line. I told her I had approval. She told me the approval was under review. I told her the approval letter was dated and signed by the compliance officer. She told me the compliance officer did not have authority to approve fences. Only she did, as Welcome Committee Chair. I asked her why the paperwork did not mention that. She told me I was being argumentative, and that argumentative homeowners always ended up in violation. Then she pulled out her phone, took 3 pictures of my post holes, and told me she was filing an emergency complaint with the board. The board meets once a month. It was the second week of the month. I had just started digging. I asked her what I was supposed to do in the meantime. She smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. "You will pay the fee, then you will pay the fee about the fee," she said, like she had been practicing it. I did not understand what that meant, but I wrote it down in my phone notes anyway, because I had a feeling it was going to matter later. She saw me typing, and her smile disappeared. She told me recording her without consent was illegal. I told her I was taking notes, not recording. She told me notes were the same thing, and that I was creating a hostile environment. I asked her how standing in my own yard with a shovel could be hostile. She told me she was calling the police if I did not stop harassing her. I had not said anything louder than a normal conversation volume. I had not stepped toward her. I had not touched her, or her clipboard, or her roll of caution tape. But somehow, in her version of events, I was the aggressor. The contractor arrived while she was still talking. His name was Rick, and he had been doing fence work in Montreal for 15 years. He pulled up in a white truck with his company logo on the side, got out, looked at Melissa, looked at me, and immediately said, "Is this going to be a problem?" Melissa told him the project was under stop work order, and that if he touched any part of my property, she would have him fined and reported to the city. Rick asked to see the stop work order. Melissa told him it was being filed. Rick asked when it would be filed. Melissa told him that was not his concern. Rick looked at me, and I showed him the approval letter on my phone. He read it, nodded, and told Melissa he was proceeding based on valid documentation. Melissa told him he was making a huge mistake. Rick told her he had liability insurance and a contract. Then he started unloading fence panels. Melissa did not leave. She stood under the eave of my garage, out of the drizzle, and watched us work. Every time Rick dug a hole, she took a picture. Every time I handed him a post, she took a picture. Every time he checked the level, she took a picture. I counted 14 photos in the first 30 minutes. She also made 2 phone calls, both loud enough that I could hear her side of the conversation. The first call was to someone named Greg, who I assumed was on the board, and she told him I was violating quiet hours by having a contractor on site. It was 2 in the afternoon. Quiet hours, according to the HOA covenant I had read cover to cover, were 10 at night to 7 in the morning. The second call was to someone she called the compliance officer, and she told him to put a lien notice on my account immediately, because I had refused to comply with a verbal stop work order. I had not refused anything. She had never given me a written order. But I was starting to realize that in Melissa's world, facts were optional. Rick finished the first post hole and set the post. It was perfectly plumb, exactly on the property line, and 18 inches deep, which was the code requirement for frost heave in Quebec. Melissa walked over, looked at it, and told Rick he had installed it in the wrong location. Rick asked her to show him the survey. She told him surveys were not reliable. Rick asked her what she was basing her measurement on. She pointed at a wooden stake about 3 feet away and said that was the true property line. Rick asked her who placed that stake. She said the HOA did. Rick asked her when. She said it did not matter. Rick pulled out his phone, opened a mapping app, and showed her the parcel overlay. The wooden stake she was pointing at was inside my neighbor's yard. She told him the app was wrong. Rick told her he was done talking to her. She told him she was noting his refusal to cooperate in her report. Rick went back to digging. I had been trying to stay calm, but I could feel the situation starting to spiral. My refinance application was in underwriting, and any lien threat could wreck the deal. The bank had already warned me that HOA disputes were red flags, and if Melissa actually managed to file something, even a bogus lien, it could delay closing by weeks or kill the application outright. I could not afford that. I had locked in a rate that was 2 points lower than the current market, and if I lost it, my monthly payment would jump by almost $400. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called my attorney. Her name was Sarah, and she specialized in property disputes. I had hired her 2 months earlier when Melissa first started sending me threatening emails about my lawn height, which was another story entirely. But the point was that Sarah already knew who Melissa was and what kind of tactics she used. I explained what was happening. Sarah told me to keep working, document everything, and not engage with Melissa beyond factual responses. She also told me she was going to send a letter to the HOA demanding they produce the legal basis for any stop work claim and threatening sanctions if they filed a fraudulent lien. She said she could have the letter delivered by end of business today, but she needed one document from me first, a signed copy of the contractor agreement showing the start date and scope of work. I had it. I told her I would scan it and email it within 10 minutes. She told me to stay on the line while I did it, because she wanted to hear if Melissa escalated further. I went inside, leaving Rick to keep working. My phone battery was at 18%, which was not great, because I had been recording video clips all morning and had not plugged in. I grabbed my charger, plugged it into the kitchen outlet, and opened the scanner app. The contractor agreement was in the folder on the counter. I scanned the first page, then the second, and I was halfway through the third when I heard Melissa yelling outside. I ran to the window. She was standing next to Rick, holding the roll of caution tape, and she was trying to stretch it across the post hole. Rick was telling her to get out of his work area. She was telling him he was trespassing on HOA common property. Rick pointed at the survey map taped to his clipboard and told her the property line was marked. She told him the map was fake. Rick told her she was delusional. She told him he was fired. I finished the scan, emailed it to Sarah, and ran back outside. Melissa had managed to string the caution tape between 2 of my landscaping stakes, creating a barrier directly across the path Rick needed to use to move the next post. Rick was standing there with a fence panel in his hands, looking at me like he was waiting for permission to rip the tape down. I told him to wait. I walked over to Melissa and asked her, as calmly as I could, what legal authority she had to place tape on my property. She told me the tape was not on my property, it was on the HOA setback easement. I told her the setback easement was a non-exclusive access corridor, not HOA land, and that I had every right to build within the approved setback distance. She told me I was wrong, and that the board had updated the setback rule last year. I asked her to show me the updated rule. She told me it was in the board minutes. I asked her for a copy of the minutes. She told me minutes were not public. I told her that under Quebec law, HOA meeting minutes were required to be available to homeowners on request. She told me I was being a lawyer wannabe and that real lawyers did not argue on their lawn in the rain. Sarah was still on the phone. She had heard the whole thing. She told me to tell Melissa that Sarah was on the line and that Melissa should stop touching my property immediately or Sarah would file for an emergency injunction within the hour. I repeated that, word for word. Melissa looked at my phone, looked at me, and told me I was bluffing. I put the phone on speaker. Sarah introduced herself, gave her bar number, and told Melissa that every word of this conversation was being recorded with my consent as the property owner, and that any further interference would be documented as evidence of harassment and tortious interference with contract. Melissa's face went red. She told Sarah that Sarah did not scare her. Sarah told Melissa that was fine, but the judge probably would. Then Sarah told me to take 3 photos of the caution tape placement and email them to her immediately. I did. Melissa ripped the tape down herself before I finished the 3rd photo. Melissa left. She did not say goodbye. She just walked across my yard, got into her car, which was parked in front of my mailbox, blocking my mail carrier who had just pulled up, and drove off. The mail carrier, a guy named Dave who I recognized from the route, leaned out of his truck and asked me if everything was okay. I told him it was an HOA thing. He nodded and said he had seen Melissa do that to 3 other houses on the block in the last month. I asked him what she had done. He said she had tried to tell him he could not deliver mail to houses that were under violation notice. He said he had told her that was not how mail delivery worked, and that if she blocked his route again, he would file a complaint with the postal inspector. He also said one of the homeowners she had targeted, the guy 2 doors down, had started keeping a log of every time she showed up, and that log was now over 40 pages long. He said I should talk to that neighbor. I thanked him and made a mental note. Rick and I worked for another 2 hours. We got 4 posts set, all of them perfectly aligned, all of them inspected and photographed by me from 3 angles each. The drizzle stopped around 4, and by 5 we had the first section of fence panel installed. It looked great. It was exactly the style approved in my application. 6-foot cedar privacy fence, natural finish, black metal hinges, matching the 6 other fences on my street that had been installed in the last 2 years. Rick told me he would be back tomorrow to finish the rest. I paid him for the day, tipped him an extra $50 for dealing with Melissa, and he left. I went inside, plugged my phone in properly this time, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and the folder of documents. Sarah called me back at 6. She had finished the letter and sent it via email to the HOA board president, the compliance officer, and Melissa, with a copy to the property management company that administered the association. The letter was 3 pages long and laid out a very simple argument. I had received written approval. I had complied with all covenant requirements. I had hired a licensed contractor, and any attempt to interfere with the project or file a lien without documented legal cause would constitute bad faith and W-tandon. It would result in a claim for damages, attorney fees, and sanctions. Sarah told me the board would probably respond within 48 hours, and that response would tell us whether this was going to be a quick fight or a long one. She also told me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. Document everything, stay polite, and do not let Melissa bait me into saying something she could use against me. I spent the rest of the evening scanning and organizing. I had the approval letter, the covenant section on fences, the survey map, the contractor agreement, photos of every stage of the work so far, and timestamps for every interaction with Melissa. I also pulled up the HOA bylaws, which were posted on the association website, and I read through the section on enforcement procedures. It was very clear. Any compliance action required a written notice, a 14-day cure period, a hearing opportunity, and a board vote. Melissa had skipped all of that. She had gone straight to threats, tape, and phone calls. That was a problem for her, and I was going to make sure it stayed a problem. The next morning, Rick showed up at 8, Melissa showed up at 8:15. This time she was not alone. She had brought a man with her, a guy in his 50s wearing a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. He introduced himself as Greg Fontaine, board president. He was holding a tablet and a clipboard, and he looked tired. He told me he had received Sarah's letter and he wanted to resolve this before it became a legal issue. I told him that was great, and that the easiest way to resolve it was to let me finish my fence, which I had permission to build. He said he understood that, but that there had been a procedural issue with the approval process, and the board needed to re-vote on my application to make sure it was compliant with the updated setback policy. I asked him what updated setback policy. He tapped his tablet and showed me a screenshot of a board resolution from October of last year. The resolution said that all new fences had to maintain a minimum setback of 36 inches from the property line to allow for maintenance access. My fence was 12 inches from the property line, which was the setback specified in the original covenant. I pointed that out. He said the new resolution superseded the covenant. I told him that under Quebec law, an HOA could not unilaterally change a recorded covenant without a supermajority vote of the homeowners, and that even then, the change had to be filed with the county, and could not be applied retroactively to approved projects. He stared at me for a long time. Then he looked at Melissa. Then he looked back at me. He said he would need to consult with the association attorney. Melissa did not like that answer. She told Greg that he was letting me bully the board and that if he did not issue a stop work order right now, she was going to file a complaint against him with the management company. Greg told her to calm down. She told him not to talk to her like that. He told her she was out of line. She told him he was spineless. Then she turned to me and said, "You will pay the fee, then you will pay the fee about the fee." It was the second time she had said it, and I still did not know what it meant, but I made sure to note the timestamp in my phone. Greg sighed and told me he would get back to me by end of day. I told him that was fine, but that Rick was going to keep working unless I received a written stop work order signed by the board and specifying the legal basis. Greg said he understood. Melissa said I was going to regret this. Then they both left. Rick and I installed 4 more panels that day. By the end of the afternoon, the fence was 2/3 complete, and it looked fantastic. My neighbors on both sides came over to compliment the work. The guy 2 doors down, the one Dave the mail carrier had mentioned, introduced himself as Paul. He was in his 40s, worked from home, and had been dealing with Melissa for almost a year. He told me she had tried to fine him for parking his car in his own driveway overnight, claiming it violated a rule about garage use that did not exist. He had fought it, won, and then she had retaliated by reporting him to the city for a permit violation on a deck he had built 5 years earlier. The city had inspected, found no violation, and closed the complaint, but Melissa had filed 3 more complaints after that, each one more frivolous than the last. Paul said he had documented everything and had recently discovered something interesting. Melissa had been submitting compliance complaints under other board members' names without their knowledge, using her access to the HOA email system. If you are enjoying this chaos, smash that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to get even messier. I asked Paul how he found that out. He said he had filed a records request and received copies of all compliance correspondence for the last year. Buried in the email headers were metadata tags showing that the messages had been sent from Melissa's IP address, even when they were signed by other board members. He said he had not done anything with that information yet, because he was waiting for the right moment. I told him I might have a use for it. He smiled and said he thought I might. He gave me his number and told me to call him if I needed a witness or a document. I thanked him and filed that away as ammunition. That night, I got an email from Greg. The subject line said, "Fence application update." The body of the email said that the board had reviewed my application and determined that it was compliant with all applicable covenants, but that due to ongoing concerns about setback measurements, the board was requiring me to hire a licensed surveyor to verify the property line before proceeding further. The email also said that I would be responsible for the surveyor's fee, estimated at $1,200, and that if I refused, the board would place a hold on my project pending resolution. There was no board vote mentioned. There was no hearing mentioned. There was no reference to any specific covenant provision that required a new survey. It was just a demand, dressed up as a procedural requirement, designed to cost me money and delay the project. I forwarded the email to Sarah. She called me 10 minutes later and told me the demand was unenforceable. She said the board could not require me to hire a surveyor for a project that had already been approved based on an existing survey, and that if they tried to enforce the hold, she would file for declaratory relief and an award of attorney fees. She also said she was going to reply to Greg directly and inform him that any further delays would be treated as bad faith and would trigger an immediate lawsuit. I told her to go ahead. She said she would have the reply sent within the hour. I hung up and went to bed, but I did not sleep well. The next morning, I got a call from my mortgage broker. She told me that the underwriting team had flagged my file because they had received notification of a potential lien from the Harbor Point Fence Compliance Association. I felt my stomach drop. I asked her what the notification said. She said it was vague, just a standard alert that the HOA had filed a compliance action and that there might be outstanding fees. She said it was not a formal lien yet, but that the underwriters were going to hold my file until it was cleared. I told her it was a bogus complaint and that my attorney was handling it. She said that was good, but that I needed to get a clearance letter from the HOA within the next 72 hours or the bank would have to pull the rate lock. 72 hours. 3 days. Melissa had just cost me my refinance timeline, and she had done it without filing an actual lien, just by sending a notice to the county clerk. I called Sarah immediately. She was furious. She said that filing a false lien notice was actionable, and that if Melissa had done this without board approval, it could also be a violation of her fiduciary duty as an HOA officer. She told me to get a copy of the notice from the county, which I could request online, and to forward it to her the second I had it. I pulled up the county clerk website, submitted the request, and paid the $5 processing fee. The document was available for download within 20 minutes. It was a single-page form titled Notice of Potential Assessment, and it listed my property address, the HOA name, and a check box that said Compliance Action Pending. It was signed by Melissa Lewis in her capacity as Welcome Committee Chair. There was no board vote documented. There was no hearing date. There was no amount owed. It was just a flag, but it was enough to tank my refinance. Sarah told me she was filing an emergency motion to expunge the notice and to sanction Melissa personally. She said the hearing would probably be set within a week, but that in the meantime, I needed to finish the fence and gather every piece of evidence I could. She also said I should start talking to other homeowners who had been targeted by Melissa because a pattern of abuse would strengthen the case. I told her about Paul and his email metadata discovery. She told me to get a declaration from him, signed and notarized, laying out everything he knew. I called Paul. He said he would have it ready by tomorrow. I thanked him and told him this was going to get ugly. He said it already was ugly, and that he was glad someone was finally fighting back. Rick came back that afternoon and finished the fence. It was perfect. Every post was level. Every panel was aligned. Every hinge was tight. He took photos of the completed work, gave me a signed completion certificate, and told me to call him if I ever needed anything else. I paid him the final invoice, thanked him for sticking with the project despite the chaos, and watched him drive away. Then I stood in my backyard and looked at the fence. It was exactly what I had wanted: clean, tall, private, and legal. And Melissa hated it. The next day, I got a text from Paul. He said Melissa had just posted in the neighborhood group chat, which was a private Facebook group for Harbor Point residents, claiming that I had built an illegal fence and that anyone who supported me was enabling a violation of community standards. He sent me a screenshot. The post was 3 paragraphs long and full of accusations. I had ignored stop work orders. I had harassed board members. I had threatened legal action to bully the association. And I had installed a fence that was too tall, too close to the property line, and not approved by the architectural committee. Every single sentence was a lie. Paul said at least a dozen people had already commented, and most of them were calling Melissa out. One commenter, a woman named Sandra, had replied with a copy of my approval letter which she said she had seen posted on the HOA bulletin board 2 months earlier. Another commenter, a man named Tom, had said that Melissa had tried the same stunt with his shed, and that the board had eventually apologized and reimbursed his legal fees. Melissa had not replied to any of the comments yet, but Paul said he was watching the thread. I called Sarah and told her about the post. She told me to screenshot everything and send it to her. She said that defamation in a semi-public forum was discoverable, and that if we ended up in court, the post would be Exhibit A. She also told me that the hearing on the emergency motion had been set for 2 days from now, and that I needed to be ready to testify. She said the judge would want to hear directly from me about the timeline, the approvals, and the impact of the false notice on my refinance. I told her I was ready. She said good, because Melissa was going to be there and she was probably going to bring the board president and the compliance officer as witnesses. I asked her what I should wear. She told me to dress like I was going to a job interview, neat, professional, not flashy. I told her I would be there. The hearing was held in a small courtroom in downtown Montreal on a Thursday morning. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks, carrying a leather binder with printed copies of every document Sarah had told me to bring. Sarah met me in the hallway and walked me through what to expect. She said the judge would review the motion, hear testimony, and decide whether to expunge the notice and whether to issue sanctions. She said sanctions could include a fine, an order barring Melissa from filing further notices without board approval, or even a referral for disciplinary action if the judge thought her conduct was egregious enough. I asked her what our chances were. She said that based on the evidence, we should win, but that judges could be unpredictable when it came to HOA disputes, because a lot of them saw these cases as petty neighbor squabbles. I told her this was not petty. She said she knew that, and that she was going to make sure the judge knew it too. Melissa arrived 10 minutes late, walking in with Greg and a woman I did not recognize. The woman was in her 30s, wearing a blazer and carrying a briefcase. Sarah leaned over and whispered that the woman was probably the HOA's attorney. Melissa looked at me, looked at Sarah, and then looked away. She did not say anything. Greg looked uncomfortable. The woman in the blazer looked bored. We all sat down and waited for the judge. The judge was a woman in her 60s with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain. She called the case, asked both attorneys to state their appearances, and then asked Sarah to present the motion. Sarah stood up and laid it out in 5 minutes. I had received written approval for the fence. I had complied with every requirement. Melissa had filed a false notice without board authorization, and that notice had caused immediate financial harm by jeopardizing my refinance. She submitted the approval letter, the survey, the contractor completion certificate, the county notice, and the mortgage broker's email as exhibits. The judge reviewed them, looked up, and asked the HOA's attorney to respond. The HOA's attorney stood up and said that the notice was not false. It was precautionary, filed in good faith based on concerns about compliance raised by the Welcome Committee chair. She said the board had not voted to file the notice because the board delegated compliance enforcement to committee chairs under the bylaws, and that Melissa had been acting within her authority. She said the notice did not constitute a lien, it was simply a flag, and that flags were standard practice in HOA administration. She said that if I wanted the notice removed, all I had to do was pay for an independent survey to verify the property line, and if the survey confirmed compliance, the notice would be withdrawn immediately. She sat down. The judge looked at Sarah. Sarah stood up and said, "Your Honor, the bylaws do not delegate lien notice authority to committee chairs. They delegate it to the board by majority vote after a hearing." There was no hearing. There was no vote. Miss Lewis acted unilaterally, and she did so in retaliation for Mr. Soule Coleman's refusal to stop work on an approved project. This is not good faith. This is harassment. And the harm is not speculative, it is documented. My client is losing his refinance rate lock as we speak. The judge asked the HOA's attorney if there was a board vote. The attorney said no. The judge asked if there was a hearing. The attorney said no. The judge asked why not. The attorney said that the board had been waiting for additional information. The judge asked what information. The attorney did not have an answer. The judge looked at Melissa and asked her directly if she had filed the notice on her own. Melissa said yes. The judge asked her why. Melissa said because I was building an illegal fence. The judge asked her what made it illegal. Melissa said it was too close to the property line. The judge asked her if she had measured it. Melissa said she did not need to measure it, she could see it. The judge asked her if she had a survey. Melissa said surveys were not reliable. The judge took off her glasses, set them on the bench, and said, "Ma'am, I am going to stop you there." The judge said that filing a lien notice without a factual basis was a serious matter, and that filing one without board approval was worse. She said she was going to grant the motion to expunge, and that the county clerk would be ordered to remove the notice from the record within 24 hours. She also said she was imposing a sanction. Melissa was barred from filing any further compliance notices regarding my property without a documented board vote, and if she violated that order, she would be held in contempt. The judge also said she was ordering the HOA to reimburse me for the county clerk fee and for any documented costs related to clearing the notice with my mortgage lender. She asked Sarah if there were any other costs. Sarah said attorney fees. The judge asked how much. Sarah said $3,500 so far. The judge looked at the HOA's attorney and asked if the HOA wanted to contest that. The HOA's attorney said no. The judge ordered the HOA to pay it within 30 days. Then, she dismissed the case. Melissa stood up and said, "This is not over." The judge looked at her and said, "Yes, it is. Sit down." Melissa sat down. Greg looked like he wanted to disappear. The HOA's attorney closed her briefcase and walked out without saying a word. Sarah and I stood up, shook hands, and left the courtroom. In the hallway, Sarah told me that was one of the cleanest wins she had ever seen, and that I should send the judge a thank you note. I told her I would. Then I asked her what happened next. She said the notice would be expunged by tomorrow, I could get a clearance letter from the county, and my refinance should be back on track. She also said that Melissa was probably going to try something else, and that I should keep documenting. I told her I would. We parted ways, and I drove home. That afternoon, I got an email from my mortgage broker. She said the underwriting team had received the court order expunging the notice, and that my file was clear. She said the rate lock was still valid, and that we were back on schedule for closing in 2 weeks. I almost cried. I forwarded the email to Sarah, to Paul, and to Rick, because they had all been part of making this happen. Paul replied with a thumbs up emoji and a message that said, "Told you she was a nightmare." Rick replied with, "That fence is still perfect, by the way." Sarah replied with, "Now let's make sure she does not do this to anyone else." 2 days later, Paul called me and said the neighborhood group chat had exploded. He said Melissa's post about my illegal fence had been deleted by the group admin, who was not affiliated with the HOA board, and replaced with a pinned post explaining that the fence had been approved, the compliance action had been dismissed, and that any future posts making false claims about homeowners would result in removal from the group. He said Melissa had replied to the pinned post, calling the admin biased, and the admin had banned her from the group. He said at least 20 people had commented in support of the ban, and several had shared their own stories of being targeted by Melissa. One woman said Melissa had tried to fine her for painting her front door the wrong shade of blue. Another man said Melissa had reported him to the fire marshal for having a propane grill on his patio, which was completely legal. A third person said Melissa had sent them a letter threatening foreclosure over a single missed HOA payment that had been caused by a bank error and was corrected the next day. The pattern was clear. Melissa was using her position to harass anyone who questioned her, and she had been doing it for years. I told Paul I wanted to bring all of this to the board. He said that was a great idea, but that the board was scared of Melissa because she had been on the welcome committee longer than most of them had been on the board, and she had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who crossed her. I asked him what it would take to get her removed. He said it would take a board vote, but that the board would not vote unless they had cover, meaning evidence that she was creating legal liability for the association. I told him we had that evidence, the court order, the attorney fees, the expunged notice, and now a growing list of homeowner complaints. He said that might be enough. I asked him if he would help me organize a presentation for the next board meeting. He said absolutely. The next board meeting was 3 weeks away. Paul and I spent that time collecting declarations. We reached out to every homeowner who had posted in the group chat about being targeted by Melissa, and we asked them to write a short statement describing what had happened, when it had happened, and what the outcome was. We got 12 statements. We also got copies of emails, letters, and text messages Melissa had sent, many of which contained threats that were not backed by any board vote or covenant provision. We compiled everything into a binder, with tabs for each homeowner and a summary page at the front. Paul also included his email metadata analysis, showing that Melissa had been filing complaints under other board members' names. That was the smoking gun. The board meeting was held in the clubhouse on a Tuesday night at 7. Paul and I arrived at 6:30 to set up. We brought the binder, a laptop, and a portable projector in case we needed to show documents on the wall. The clubhouse was a small room with folding tables arranged in a U-shape and about 20 folding chairs for residents. By 7, the room was packed. At least 30 people had shown up, which was unheard of for a Harbor Point board meeting. Most of them were homeowners who had signed declarations or who had heard about what we were doing and wanted to watch. Melissa was already there, sitting in the front row, arms crossed, glaring at me. Greg was at the head table with 2 other board members, a man named Steve and a woman named Linda. They all looked nervous. Greg called the meeting to order and started with the standard agenda: approval of minutes, treasurer's report, old business. I waited through all of it, watching the clock. Finally, Greg said, "New business," and I raised my hand. He looked at me, sighed, and said, "Go ahead." I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and said, "My name is David Coleman, and I am here to present evidence of a pattern of harassment and abuse by Melissa Lewis, in her capacity as Welcome Committee Chair. I ask that the board review this evidence and take appropriate action to protect homeowners from further retaliation." I opened the binder and walked Greg through the first 3 declarations. Each one described a different incident: bogus fines, false compliance threats, intimidation of contractors. I showed him the emails Melissa had sent, highlighting the parts where she threatened liens, foreclosures, or bans from amenities without any board vote. Then I showed him Paul's email metadata analysis. I explained that Melissa had been sending compliance complaints using other board members' names and email addresses without their knowledge, and that this was not only unethical, it was potentially criminal fraud. Greg's face went pale. Steve and Linda leaned in to look at the documents. Melissa stood up and said, "This is a setup, and you are all falling for it." I ignored her and kept going. I showed Greg the court order from the hearing, the attorney fee award, and the mortgage broker's email documenting the harm caused by the false lien notice. I also handed him a printed copy of the neighborhood group chat thread, with all of Melissa's deleted posts and the admin's explanation for banning her. I said, "This is not one isolated incident. This is a pattern that has been going on for years, and it is costing the association money, credibility, and member trust. I recommend that the board vote to remove Ms. Lewis from her position as Welcome Committee Chair, effective immediately, and that the board adopt a policy requiring all compliance actions to be approved by majority vote before any notice is sent to a homeowner." Greg did not say anything for a long time. Then he looked at Steve and Linda. Steve said, "I did not know she was using my name." Linda said, "I did not either." Greg looked at Melissa and said, "Is this true?" Melissa said, "I was acting in the best interest of the community." Greg said, "That is not what I asked." Melissa said, "You are all cowards." Greg said, "Melissa, sit down or leave." Melissa said, "I am not going anywhere." Greg said, "Then I am calling for a vote." I move that we remove Melissa Lewis from the position of Welcome Committee Chair, effective immediately, and that we refer the email fraud issue to our attorney for further review. Steve said, I second. Linda said, I also second. Greg said, all in favor? All three raised their hands. Greg said, the motion passes. Melissa, you are removed. Melissa did not leave quietly. She stood up, pointed at me, and said, you will regret this. Then she pointed at Greg and said, you are all going to regret this. Then she grabbed her bag, knocked over a folding chair, and walked out. The room was silent. Then someone in the back started clapping. Then someone else joined in. Then the whole room was clapping. Paul looked at me and grinned. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Greg thanked me for bringing the issue forward and said the board would be conducting a full audit of all compliance actions taken over the last 2 years. He also said the board was going to implement the policy I had suggested, requiring board approval before any compliance notice was filed. He said he would send an email to all homeowners explaining the changes and apologizing for the way things had been handled. I thanked him and sat down. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but I did not hear any of it. I was too busy feeling relieved. The next morning, I got a call from Sarah. She said she had heard about the meeting from Paul and that she was proud of me. She also said she had received a call from the HOA's attorney, who had informed her that the board was planning to settle any outstanding disputes I might have and wanted to know if I had any additional claims. I told Sarah I did not want to drag this out any further, but that I thought the board should pay for an independent audit of the compliance process to make sure no other homeowners had been targeted the same way. Sarah said she would ask for that. 2 days later, the board agreed. The audit was completed 6 weeks later and found that Melissa had filed over 60 compliance notices in the last 18 months, and that 41 of them had been issued without board approval and were not supported by any covenant provision. The board sent apology letters to every affected homeowner and refunded over $12,000 in bogus fines. 3 months after the meeting, I closed on my refinance. The rate lock held. My monthly payment dropped by $380. I sent Sarah a bottle of wine and a thank you card. I sent Paul a gift card to the hardware store. I sent Rick a referral for 2 other neighbors who wanted fences. And I stood in my backyard, looking at the fence that had caused all of this, and I felt like I had won something bigger than a legal case. I had stood up to a bully who had been terrorizing an entire neighborhood, and I had done it the right way, with documentation, patience, and a refusal to back down. Melissa never apologized. She moved out of Harbor Point 6 months later. I heard from Paul that she had sold her house and relocated to a different suburb, and that her new HOA had already flagged her for sending unauthorized emails to board members. Some people never learn. The fence is still perfect. The gate swings smooth. The hinges do not squeak. Every post is level. Every panel is aligned. And every time I walk through that gate, I think about the fact that I did not let Melissa win. I did not let her bully me into tearing it down. I did not let her cost me my refinance. I did not let her silence me, or intimidate me, or make me feel like I was the problem. I fought back. And I won. And the neighborhood is better for it. The HOA still exists, obviously. Greg is still the board president. The compliance process got cleaned up. The bylaws got updated. The audit report got posted on the website. And now, when someone gets a compliance notice, they know it went through a real process, with a real vote and a real basis in the covenants. That is not nothing. That is progress. That is what happens when you refuse to let the Karens of the world win just because they are loud. I still see Paul around the neighborhood. We wave. Sometimes we grab coffee and talk about boring things like lawn care and gutter cleaning, which is a relief after everything we went through. He told me last week that 2 more board seats are opening up in the spring election, and that he is thinking about running. I told him he should. He would be great at it. He asked me if I would run too. I told him I had done my time in the trenches and that I was happy to support him from the sidelines. He laughed and said that was fair. The thing I learned from all of this is that HOAs are not inherently bad. They are just organizations, and organizations are only as good or as bad as the people running them. When you get someone like Melissa in a position of power, someone who sees enforcement as a weapon instead of a service, the whole system breaks down. But when you get people who actually care about fairness, who follow the rules, who listen to homeowners, the system works. It is not perfect. It is never going to be perfect. But it can be better. And it is better now than it was before I dug that first post hole. So if you are dealing with an HOA nightmare right now, if you are getting bogus fines or threats or harassment from someone who thinks they own your property just because they sit on a committee, here is my advice. Document everything. Stay calm. Get a lawyer if you need one. And do not back down. These people count on you giving up. They count on you being too tired, too scared, too broke to fight. Do not give them that satisfaction. Fight. Win. Make them follow their own rules. And when it is over, make sure the rules get fixed so the next person does not have to go through what you went through. I will catch you again soon.